On the morning of July 25, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stood beside his M4 Sherman tank near the village of Marigny in Normandy, watching the sky fill with American bombers. The ground shook. The air vibrated. Over 2,000 heavy bombers were dropping their payloads on a strip of German defensive positions barely 4 miles wide and 2 miles deep. Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armoured Division. He was 30 years old. He had been fighting Germans since landing in Normandy 6 weeks earlier, and in those 6 weeks, he had learned what German commanders believed about American armour. The Germans called the Sherman slow. They called it poorly armoured. They called it a death trap that burned when hit. German tankers had a name for it. They called it the Tommycooker because British and American crews cooked inside when the ammunition caught fire. The German High Command had studied American tank doctrine and dismissed it. American tanks were designed for infantry support, not tank-to-tank combat. They lacked the armour to survive hits from German guns. They lacked the firepower to penetrate German armour at normal combat ranges. German officers briefed their tank crews that one Tiger or Panther was worth 4 or 5 Shermans in direct engagement. The mathematics seemed clear. German tanks were superior. German crews were better trained. German tactics were more sophisticated. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But Abrams understood something the German analysts had missed. The Sherman was not designed to fight other tanks in static defensive positions. It was designed to move. It was designed to exploit breakthroughs, to race through gaps in enemy lines, to appear where the enemy did not expect it. The Sherman's greatest advantage was not its gun or its armour. It was its reliability, its ease of maintenance, and above all, its numbers. On this morning, as the bombs fell and the earth trembled, Abrams was about to demonstrate what 4,000 Shermans could accomplish when they stopped fighting the way the Germans expected and started fighting the way they were designed to fight. The situation in Normandy by late July 1944 had become a strategic nightmare for the Allies. 6 weeks after D-Day, American and British forces remained trapped in a narrow beachhead. The original invasion plan had called for the capture of Cherbourg by D+8 and the breakout toward Paris by D+20. Instead, American forces had spent 7 weeks fighting through hedgerow country, a landscape of small fields bordered by earthen embankments topped with dense vegetation that had been growing for centuries. Each hedgerow was a natural fortress. German defenders dug into the embankments, positioned machine guns at the corners of fields, registered artillery on every intersection. American tanks could not push through the hedgerows. When they tried to climb over, they exposed their thin belly armour to German anti-tank guns. The fighting was brutal, close-quarters infantry combat measured in yards, not miles. The casualty rates were staggering. The 29th Infantry Division, which had landed at Omaha Beach, suffered over 200% casualties in its rifle companies during the first 6 weeks. That meant every rifleman had been killed, wounded, or replaced, and then his replacement had been killed, wounded, or replaced as well. Some companies went through 3 complete sets of soldiers. The veterans called the hedgerow fighting the green hell. Progress was measured in hedgerows captured, sometimes 3 or 4 per day at terrible cost. The front line had moved less than 15 miles inland in 7 weeks. German commanders observed this and grew confident. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had taken command of German forces in the West on July 3rd after Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was dismissed, reported to Hitler that the situation was stabilizing. The Americans were bleeding themselves white against prepared defenses. Their tanks were proving ineffective in the close terrain. The hedgerows neutralized Allied air superiority because aircraft could not identify targets hidden beneath the dense vegetation. German losses were significant, but replacements were arriving. The defensive line was holding. Von Kluge's assessment reflected standard German military thinking about American armour. German tank doctrine emphasized quality over quantity. A well-trained crew in a superior tank could defeat multiple inferior opponents. The Tiger tank weighed 57 tons and mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The Panther weighed 45 tons and combined excellent armor with a high-velocity 75mm gun capable of penetrating Sherman frontal armor at over 1,000 meters. Both tanks were mechanically complex, difficult to manufacture, and required extensive maintenance, but in direct combat, they dominated. The Sherman weighed 33 tons, significantly lighter than German heavy tanks. Its original 75mm gun could not penetrate Panther frontal armor at any range, and could only penetrate Tiger armor at point-blank distances under 500 meters. The Sherman's armor was thin enough that German 88mm guns could destroy it at ranges where the Sherman could not effectively return fire. In the hedgerow fighting, where engagements occurred at close range and tanks could not maneuver, these disadvantages were less pronounced. But German commanders expected that if the Americans ever broke into open country, their tanks would be slaughtered by superior German armor. What German intelligence failed to appreciate was the industrial reality behind the Sherman. American factories were producing Shermans at rates that seemed impossible to German planners. The Detroit tank arsenal alone produced over 22,000 Shermans during the war. Fisher Body, Chrysler, Ford, Pacific Car, and Foundry, and other manufacturers added tens of thousands more. Total Sherman production reached 49,234 tanks, more than all German tank production of all types combined during the entire war. Germany built approximately 1,350 Tigers and 6,000 Panther tanks. America built nearly 50,000 Shermans. The production disparity meant that American armored divisions could absorb losses that would have destroyed German units. A German Panzer division that lost 30 tanks in a week might wait months for replacements. An American armored division could receive replacement tanks within days. The 4th Armored Division, which Abrams served in, received 139 replacement Sherman tanks in August 1944 alone, more tanks than most German divisions possessed in their entire inventory. Beyond numbers, the Sherman offered advantages German analysts systematically underestimated. The tank was mechanically reliable. A Sherman could operate for extended periods without breakdown. German Panthers and Tigers required constant maintenance. The Panther's final drive gearbox failed regularly, often after as few as 150 kilometers of operation. Tiger engines overheated. Both tanks consumed fuel at rates that strained German logistics. A Panther needed approximately 2.5 liters of fuel per kilometer. A Sherman needed about 1.5. When fuel was plentiful, this difference was manageable. When fuel was scarce, as it increasingly became for German forces in 1944, the difference was decisive. The Sherman was also easier to repair in the field. American tank crews and maintenance personnel could swap engines, replace transmissions, and repair damage using standardized parts that were interchangeable between vehicles. German tanks required precision fitting. Parts from one Panther might not fit another. Repairs that American crews completed in hours took German mechanics days. When a Sherman was damaged but not destroyed, it could often be returned to service quickly. When a Panther was damaged, it frequently had to be abandoned because no repair facilities were available. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army, understood these advantages better than most. Patton had studied armored warfare since the First World War. He had commanded tank units in 1918 and had spent the interwar years developing doctrine for mechanized warfare. Patton believed that armor's primary purpose was not to destroy enemy tanks. It was to create chaos in enemy rear areas, to cut supply lines, to overrun headquarters, to prevent the enemy from organizing coherent defense. Tank-to-tank combat was sometimes necessary, but it was not the objective. The objective was to keep moving, to exploit every gap, to advance so rapidly that the enemy could never establish a stable defensive line. Patton had been waiting in England while the hedgerow fighting consumed American divisions in Normandy. His Third Army was designated to exploit any breakthrough, but first there had to be a breakthrough to exploit. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, developed a plan to create that breakthrough. The operation was code-named Cobra. Operation Cobra was designed to use overwhelming air power to blast a hole through German defences west of St. Lo. The plan called for concentrated carpet bombing of a rectangular target area, approximately 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep. Heavy bombers, medium bombers, and fighter bombers would drop over 4,000 tons of high explosives and napalm on German positions. The bombardment would kill defenders, destroy fortifications, crater roads, and create such chaos that American ground forces could punch through before the Germans recovered. The target area was held by the Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armoured formations. Panzer Lehr had been created in 1943 specifically to demonstrate German armoured tactics. Its personnel were drawn from armoured warfare schools and training units. Its equipment included the latest tanks, self-propelled guns, and armoured vehicles. Under normal circumstances, Panzer Lehr would have been a formidable obstacle, but Panzer Lehr had been fighting continuously since D-Day and had received no significant replacements. The division that had landed in Normandy with over 14,000 men and 183 tanks now numbered fewer than 3,000 combat-effective soldiers and possessed perhaps 40 operational armoured vehicles. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr, had established his defensive positions along the Perrier-Saint-Lô road. His troops were dug in, camouflaged, dispersed to minimize the effect of artillery and air attack. Bayerlein was an experienced officer who had served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa. He understood American capabilities and had no illusions about his division's condition, but he also believed his defenses were adequately strong to delay any American offensive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. He did not anticipate what was about to happen. The first bombing attempt on July 24th went badly wrong. Weather delayed the attack, and when the bombers finally arrived, some dropped short of their targets, hitting American troops waiting to advance. 25 soldiers were killed, 131 wounded. General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces who had come to observe the offensive, was among the dead, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre. Bradley was furious. He had specifically requested that the bombers approach parallel to the front line to minimize the risk of short bombing. The Army Air Forces had instead flown perpendicular approaches directly over American positions. Despite the tragedy, Bradley ordered the attack to proceed the next day, July 25th. This time, the bombing was devastating. Over 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers struck the target area in waves lasting over 2 hours. The concentrated explosions created a moonscape of craters, shattered trees, and destroyed vehicles. German soldiers who survived described the experience as being at the center of an earthquake that would not stop. General Bayerlein reported that at least 70% of his troops were killed, wounded, or rendered comatose by the bombardment. Entire units ceased to exist. Communication lines were destroyed. Command posts were buried. Tanks were flipped onto, their backs by blast waves. Soldiers who were not physically injured were so psychologically shattered they could not function. Bayerlein later testified that the Panzer Lehr Division was annihilated, that only local pockets of resistance remained, and that the Americans could have walked through his positions without opposition immediately after the bombing. But the Americans did not walk through. The same cratering that destroyed German defences also blocked American vehicles. Roads were impassable. Tanks could not navigate the churned terrain. Infantry had to pick their way through debris and craters while dealing with isolated German strongpoints that had survived the bombardment. Progress on the first day was disappointing. American units advanced only about 2 miles against scattered resistance. Bradley worried that the operation was failing. The second day, July 26th, the picture began to change. American infantry secured key road junctions. Engineers cleared paths through the cratered zone. And most importantly, German reserves did not appear. The bombardment had destroyed not just frontline positions, but also the communication and transportation networks the Germans needed to coordinate a response. German units that might have counterattacked could not reach the breakthrough zone because the roads were blocked with debris and wrecked vehicles. On July 27th, American forces broke through the last German defensive positions. The door was open. What lay beyond was 60 miles of open terrain stretching south to Avranches, the gateway to Brittany and the rest of France. The hedgerow fighting was over. The exploitation phase was about to begin. General Collins, commanding 7th Corps, committed his armor. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions pushed south, bypassing resistance, leaving pockets of German defenders for follow-up infantry to handle. The tanks moved faster than anyone had anticipated. German commanders who tried to establish defensive lines found American armor had already passed their intended positions. The front was disintegrating. On July 28th, Patton's Third Army became operational. Patton had been champing at the bit for weeks, desperate to get into the fight. Now he had his chance. His orders were to exploit the breakthrough, to push through Avranches, to fan out into Brittany and capture the ports the Allies desperately needed. Patton interpreted these orders liberally. He intended to move as fast as humanly possible, to cover as much ground as conditions allowed, to keep the Germans off balance and unable to reorganize. What followed was one of the most remarkable armored advances in military history. The 4th Armored Division, with Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion leading the way, reached Avranches on July 30th, covering 35 miles in a single day against crumbling opposition. Avranches sat at a critical junction where the Normandy Peninsula narrowed to a bottleneck. Control of Avranches meant control of the gateway to Brittany and, more importantly, to the rest of France. Abrams's tanks reached the bridge over the Sea River at Avranches before the Germans could destroy it. The capture of that bridge intact was crucial. Without it, the advance would have stalled while engineers constructed a crossing under fire. With it, American armor could continue pouring south without pause. Abrams personally led the attack that secured the bridge, his tank in front, his radio coordinating the battalion's movements. The speed of the advance caught German commanders completely off guard. Field Marshal von Kluge had been assured by his staff that American armor could not move rapidly through the Norman countryside. The roads were narrow, the terrain was difficult, and American tank crews lacked the training and experience for mobile warfare. Instead, American tanks were averaging 20 to 30 miles per day, sometimes more, navigating roads that German planners had considered impassable for armored operations. The 4th Armored Division exemplified Patton's approach to warfare. The division operated in combat commands, combined arms, teams of tanks, infantry, artillery, and engineers that could fight independently or combine for larger operations. Combat Command A would lead the advance, while Combat Command B rested and refueled. Then they would switch, maintaining constant pressure on German defenders. When one column encountered strong resistance, it fixed the enemy in place, while another column bypassed and continued the advance. The Germans could not predict where the next blow would fall. Patton pushed his commanders relentlessly. His famous saying was that a pint of sweat saves a gallon of blood. He believed that rapid movement saved lives by preventing the enemy from establishing prepared defenses. Every hour spent consolidating positions was an hour the Germans had to dig in somewhere else. Speed was not just a tactical advantage. It was a moral imperative. The faster his troops moved, the fewer would die. The logistics of the advance were extraordinary. Each Sherman tank consumed approximately 1 gallon of fuel per mile. A division with over 200 tanks needed over 200 gallons per mile just for the tanks, not counting trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and other vehicles. The 4th Armored Division was burning through thousands of gallons of gasoline daily. Supply trucks raced to keep up with the advance, often traveling at night over roads that might still contain German stragglers. Ammunition consumption was equally staggering. A Sherman tank carried 97 rounds of main gun ammunition. In heavy fighting, a tank could exhaust its ammunition load in a single engagement. The division's artillery fired thousands of rounds per day. Infantry consumed millions of rifle and machine gun rounds. Everything had to be transported from supply depots near the Normandy beaches, over roads that were increasingly congested with military traffic. The Red Ball Express, the legendary truck convoy system that supplied the advancing armies, began operations on August 25th, but even before the Red Ball Express was formalized, American logistics officers were performing miracles of improvisation. Supply sergeants commandeered any vehicle that could carry cargo. French civilians with horse carts were pressed into service. Captured German trucks were refueled with American gasoline and added to the supply columns. The entire system operated on the edge of chaos, but it worked. By August 1st, the Third Army had pushed through Avranches and was fanning out into Brittany and toward the Loire River. Patton had 4 corps under his command, over 250,000 men with nearly 1,000 tanks. He turned 2 corps west toward Brittany to capture the ports and 2 corps east toward Le Mans and the heart of France. The advance accelerated. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German response was paralyzed by confusion and conflicting orders. Hitler, directing operations from his headquarters in East Prussia, refused to authorize withdrawals. He ordered counterattacks that his commanders knew were impossible. Von Kluge tried to organize a defensive line along the Seine River, but his forces were scattered, his communications disrupted, and American armor was already threatening to cut off his retreat routes. On August 7th, Hitler ordered Operation Lüttich, a counterattack aimed at cutting through to Avranches and severing the American supply lines. 4 Panzer divisions were assembled for the attack, including elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, the 2nd Panzer Division, and the 116th Panzer Division. On paper, the force was formidable. In reality, the divisions were shadows of their authorized strength. The 4 divisions together could muster perhaps 250 tanks, many in poor mechanical condition. The attack began on the night of August 6th. German tanks advanced toward Mortagne, a town on the road to Avranches. Initial progress was good. The 30th Infantry Division, holding the area, was caught off guard and suffered significant casualties. German tanks reached the outskirts of Mortagne and threatened to break through to Avranches. But daylight on August 7th brought American air power. The weather cleared, and fighter bombers swarmed over the German columns. P-47. Thunderbolts carried 5-inch rockets and 500-pound bombs. They attacked German tanks with devastating effect. Pilots reported burning vehicles stretching for miles along the roads. German tank crews abandoned their vehicles and sought cover in the hedgerows. The counterattack stalled. The 30th Division held. A battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, surrounded on Hill 317, refused to surrender and called in artillery fire on German positions for 6 days until relieved. The German counterattack had failed completely. Instead of cutting off the American advance, the Germans had concentrated their remaining armor in a salient that could itself be cut off. Bradley and Patton immediately recognized the opportunity. If American forces could swing north from Le Mans, while British and Canadian forces pushed south from Caen, they could encircle the German armies in Normandy. The trap would close near the town of Falaise. The result would be the destruction of the German forces in the west. Patton turned his forces north. The 15th Corps, led by the 5th Armoured Division, raced toward Argentan to close the southern jaw of the trap. The 4th Armoured Division continued its rampage through the German rear areas, capturing towns, destroying supply depots, and spreading chaos. German units trying to retreat found American tanks blocking their escape routes. The advance continued at breakneck speed. On August 10th, the 4th Armoured Division covered over 40 miles. On August 11th, elements of the 5th Armoured Division reached Argentan, just 15 miles from the British and Canadian forces pushing south toward Falaise. The pocket was almost closed, but then Bradley halted the advance. Patton was furious. His troops were in position to seal the pocket, to trap hundreds of thousands of German soldiers with no escape. Bradley was concerned about friendly fire incidents if American and British forces collided in the confusion of mobile warfare. He ordered Patton to hold at Argentan and wait for the British to close the gap from the north. The British advance was slower than hoped. German defences around Falaise were stubborn. The gap remained open for 5 critical days, from August 13th to August 18th. During those 5 days, tens of thousands of German soldiers escaped through the Falaise gap. They left behind their heavy equipment, their vehicles, their supplies, but they escaped with their lives. These survivors would form the core of German resistance in the battles to come. Even with the partial escape, the Falaise pocket was a catastrophe for Germany. When the gap finally closed on August 19th, approximately 50,000 German soldiers were trapped inside. Over 10,000 were killed. Another 50,000 surrendered. The German armies lost approximately 500 tanks, nearly 900 artillery pieces, and over 5,000 vehicles. As a fighting force, Army Group B ceased to exist. General Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, toured the pocket after the fighting ended. He later wrote that it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The roads were impassable due to destroyed vehicles and dead horses. The smell was indescribable. It was, Eisenhower said, one of the greatest killing grounds of the war. While the pocket was being reduced, Patton did not wait. He sent his forces racing east toward Paris and the Seine River. The 4th Armoured Division, which had been at Avranches on July 30th, reached Orleans on the Loire River on August 16th, a distance of over 150 miles in 17 days. Other divisions moved equally fast. The 7th Armoured Division reached Chartres on August 15th. The 5th Armoured Division reached Dreux on August 16th. Paris was liberated on August 25th. The Free French 2nd Armoured Division, under General Leclerc, entered the city first, a symbolic gesture arranged by Eisenhower to allow the French to liberate their own capital. American forces followed, securing the city against any German counterattack that never came. The German garrison surrendered. The occupation of Paris was over. The advance did not stop at Paris. American forces crossed the Part, Seine River, and continued east. The goal was now the German border itself. Patton believed that with sufficient supplies, he could reach the Rhine River within weeks, possibly even push into Germany before winter. The German army in the west had been shattered. There was nothing between his tanks and the German frontier but scattered, demoralized remnants. The numbers from the campaign were staggering. From July 25th, when Operation Cobra began, to August 20th, when the Falaise pocket collapsed, American forces advanced over 400 miles. They liberated nearly all of Normandy, Brittany, and the region between the Seine and Loire rivers. They destroyed the equivalent of 20 German divisions. They captured over 200,000 prisoners. American casualties were significant but far lower than the attritional hedgerow fighting. Approximately 16,000 killed and wounded compared to over 40,000 in the 7 weeks before Cobra. The Sherman tank had proven its value not through individual superiority, but through numbers, reliability, and mobility. In the 26 days from the start of Cobra to the crossing of the Seine, American armored divisions demonstrated that mass-produced tanks crewed by well-trained soldiers and led by aggressive commanders could defeat quality-focused German armor through maneuver and tempo rather than direct engagement. German tank commanders who had dismissed the Sherman as inferior were forced to revise their assessments. Major General Fritz von Breusch, captured near Falaise, told his interrogators that the American advance had been unlike anything he had experienced. The Americans did not fight the way German doctrine predicted. They did not seek decisive tank battles. They sought to bypass, encircle, and cut off. Their tanks appeared everywhere, moving faster than German commanders could react. By the time a defensive position was organized, American armor had already passed it and was attacking, something more important in the rear. Von Breusch specifically mentioned the 4th Armored Division. He said they seemed to have an unlimited supply of tanks. When one was destroyed, another appeared immediately. The division never stopped moving. They attacked at night, something German armored forces rarely did. They advanced through terrain that German planners had considered impassable for armor. The Sherman might be inferior in individual combat, von Breusch admitted, but the Americans had found a way to make that irrelevant. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, who had led the capture of the bridge at Avranches and countless other actions during the campaign, was promoted to full colonel in September 1944. He continued to command the 37th Tank Battalion through the battles in the Lorraine, the relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and the final push into Germany. By war's end, his battalion was credited with destroying 312 German tanks and over 1,300 other armoured vehicles. Abrams himself was credited with over 30 personal tank kills. After the war, Abrams rose through the ranks of the peacetime army. He commanded forces in Vietnam and eventually became Chief of Staff of the United States Army. When the Army developed a new main battle tank in the 1970s, they named it the M1 Abrams in his honor. The tank that bears his name incorporated the lessons of World War II, combining superior firepower, excellent protection, and the reliability that had made the Sherman effective. Creighton Abrams had demonstrated in 1944 that tanks were not just weapons, they were instruments of maneuver that could win campaigns through movement rather than attrition. The German intelligence failure regarding American armor paralleled their failure regarding American aircraft production. Just as German analysts had dismissed Roosevelt's 50,000 planes per year as propaganda and watched America build 300,000. German tank experts dismissed the Sherman as inferior and watched 4,000 of them advance 400 miles in less than a month. In both cases, German analysts focused on quality metrics and missed the strategic implications of quantity. The lesson was not that quality did not matter. German tanks were genuinely superior in many respects. A Tiger crew in a defensive position could destroy multiple Shermans before being neutralized. But wars are not won in isolated engagements. Wars are won through campaigns, through the ability to sustain operations, to replace losses, to maintain momentum. The Sherman could be produced faster, shipped more easily, maintained more reliably, and crewed by soldiers with less training than German tanks required. These advantages, invisible in a one-on-one comparison, proved decisive across the campaign. American industrial capacity made the Sherman possible. The same factories that had built automobiles before the war converted to tank production with remarkable efficiency. The Detroit tank arsenal applied assembly line techniques to tank manufacturing. Workers who had built Chryslers and Fords now built Shermans using similar methods. The result was a tank that could be produced in quantities German industry could not match. By 1944, American factories were producing over 1,000 tanks per month. German factories, despite desperate efforts, produced fewer than 500 tanks per month of all types. Every Sherman destroyed in France was replaced within days. Every Panther or Tiger lost was irreplaceable. The mathematics were inexorable. Germany could not win a war of attrition against American production capacity. General Patton understood this implicitly. His aggressive tactics were not recklessness. They were a calculated exploitation of American advantages. Every mile his tanks advanced, every German unit bypassed, every supply depot captured, reduced German capacity to resist. Speed was a weapon, as surely as the 75mm gun on a Sherman turret. Used properly, speed could win battles that firepower alone could not. The campaign from Normandy to the Seine demonstrated what American armor could accomplish when employed according to American doctrine rather than attempting to imitate German methods. The Sherman was not designed to stand and fight German heavy tanks. It was designed to move, to exploit, to create chaos. When American commanders used their armor this way, the results were devastating. When they attempted frontal assaults against prepared positions, casualties mounted. The difference was not the tank. The difference was the doctrine. Field Marshal von Kluge, who had assured Hitler that American armor was ineffective, was relieved of command on August 17th amid suspicions of treason. He committed suicide on August 19th while being transported back to Germany. His final letter to Hitler admitted that the war in the West was lost, that the American breakout could not be contained, and that Germany should seek peace before complete destruction. Hitler ignored the letter. The advance continued into September, slowing only when supply lines became overextended. The Red Ball Express could not keep pace with Patton's tanks. Fuel shortages became critical. Patton famously said he could be in Berlin in 2 weeks if they would only give him enough gasoline. Whether that was true remains debated by historians. What is certain is that the German army in the West had been shattered so completely that it took months to rebuild. The Shermans that had advanced 400 miles in 26 days would fight for another 8 months before Germany surrendered. They would face German counterattacks in the Ardennes, cross the Rhine River, and drive into the heart of the Reich. Throughout, the same factors that had made them successful in France continued to apply. They could be produced in numbers the Germans could not match. They could be maintained in the field. They could be crewed by soldiers without years of specialized training, and in the hands of aggressive commanders like Patton and Abrams, they could move faster and farther than the enemy believed possible. The tank crews who fought the campaign rarely thought in strategic terms. They thought about survival, about their next meal, about whether the engine would start in the morning. They learned to identify German tanks by silhouette, to estimate range by intuition, to know instantly whether a particular shot had penetrated armor or bounced off. They developed superstitions about lucky helmets and unlucky positions in formation. They named their tanks after wives and girlfriends and cartoon characters, painting names on turrets that would be repainted or replaced when the tank was destroyed. The losses among Sherman crews were significant. A Sherman hit by an 88mm round often caught fire before the crew could escape. The ammunition stored in the hull sponsons was vulnerable to penetration. When the ammunition cooked off, the results were catastrophic. Crews developed techniques to improve survival, including placing sandbags on hull tops and welding extra armor plates cut from destroyed tanks. These field modifications provided psychological comfort but limited actual protection. Later, Sherman variants addressed some of these vulnerabilities. The M4A3E8, known as the Easy 8, featured improved suspension, a higher velocity 76mm gun, and wet ammunition storage that reduced the risk of catastrophic fires. The British developed the Sherman Firefly, mounting a 17-pounder gun capable of penetrating Panther and Tiger armor at normal combat ranges. But these improved variants arrived in significant numbers only late in the war. Most of the Shermans that raced across France in August 1944 were earlier models with 75mm guns and standard armor. The crews accepted the risks because they understood the mission. They were not trying to win tank duels. They were trying to win the war. And winning the war meant moving faster, advancing farther, and capturing more ground than the enemy could defend. Every mile gained was a mile the Germans could not use for defensive positions. Every supply dump captured was fuel and ammunition the Germans could not use. Every headquarters overrun was communications and coordination the Germans could not restore. The psychological impact on German defenders was profound. German soldiers who had fought confidently against American forces in the hedgerows found themselves suddenly surrounded, cut off, abandoned by a command structure that had disintegrated. Many surrendered rather than fight. Others fled eastward, hoping to reach German lines before American armor cut them off. The disciplined Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe found itself reduced to scattered groups of hungry, exhausted men trying to escape a trap that closed tighter every hour. French civilians witnessed the transformation with astonishment. Towns that had endured 4 years of German occupation were liberated in hours. Resistance fighters who had operated in shadows emerged to guide American columns through back roads and identify collaborators. The French resistance provided intelligence, sabotaged German communications, and harassed retreating enemy columns. Their contribution to the campaign's success was significant, though often overlooked in accounts focused on armored operations. The liberation brought celebration, but also chaos. French civilians needed food, medical care, and restoration of services that had broken down. American civil affairs officers struggled to maintain order in liberated areas, while combat units pressed forward. The advance outpaced the ability to establish stable governance. In some areas, summary justice was administered, against collaborators without trial. The euphoria of liberation coexisted with the settling of scores accumulated over 4 years of occupation. For the tank crews, these scenes passed in a blur. They drove through cheering crowds, accepted flowers and wine from grateful civilians, then continued east toward the next objective. There was no time to stop, no time to celebrate, no time to process what they were experiencing. The mission was always the same: keep moving, keep advancing, keep the Germans off balance. Rest would come later, when the war was won. The August 1944 campaign became a template for American armored doctrine that influenced military thinking for generations. The emphasis on mobility over firepower, on combined arms integration, on aggressive exploitation of breakthroughs, shaped how the United States Army approached armored warfare through the Cold War and into the modern era. The campaigns in Iraq, in 1991 and 2003, applied similar principles, using superior mobility and operational tempo to defeat larger defending forces. The Sherman tank that made the 1944 campaign possible served in various forms for decades after World War II. Israel used Shermans in its wars through 1973. Other nations kept Shermans in service even longer. The tank's basic design proved adaptable to numerous upgrades and modifications. Its descendants in concept, if not in lineage, continue to emphasize the same qualities that made the Sherman effective: reliability, ease of maintenance, and the ability to be produced in quantity. The German High Command had called American tanks slow. They had called them inadequate. They had built their strategy around the assumption that German qualitative superiority would overcome American numerical advantage. They were wrong about everything. 4,000 Shermans advanced 400 miles in 26 days, destroyed the German armies in France, and proved that in modern industrial warfare, the side that can build more, maintain more, and move more will ultimately prevail. The campaign was not won by superior tanks. It was won by superior production, superior logistics, superior maintenance, and superior operational doctrine. The Sherman was the instrument, but the victory belonged to the industrial system that built it, the logistical system that supplied it, and the soldiers who crewed it. Together, they demonstrated that mass-produced quality could defeat handcrafted excellence when applied with imagination and aggression. Wars are won in factories as much as on battlefields. The German analysts who dismissed the Sherman understood tank-to-tank combat. They did not understand industrial warfare. They measured armor, thickness, and gun penetration. They did not measure production rates and maintenance requirements. They saw the individual tank and missed the system that produced it. That failure of vision cost Germany the war in the West. When historians analyze how the Allies won World War II, they often focus on famous battles and celebrated commanders. But behind every battle was equipment, and behind every piece of equipment was a factory. The Sherman tanks that raced across France were built by workers in Detroit and Flint and a dozen other American cities. Those workers never fired a shot, but their contribution was no less decisive than the soldiers who crewed the tanks. Victory required both. The men who crewed those tanks were ordinary Americans, factory workers and farmers and students who had never seen a tank before the war. They learned their trade in training camps across America, shipped overseas in cargo holds, and fought across France in machines they had come to know intimately. They knew every sound the engine made, every quirk of the transmission, every limitation and capability of their vehicle. They made the Sherman work, not because it was the best tank in the world, but because it was their tank, and they were determined to win. The German analysts who dismissed the Sherman as inadequate made a fundamental error. They measured the tank against German standards and found it wanting. They did not measure it against American standards, against the requirements of American doctrine, against the capabilities of American industry. The Sherman was not designed to be a tiger. It was designed to be a Sherman, and at being a Sherman, it was superb. It did what it was designed to do, and what it was designed to do won the war. Wars are decided by economics as much as by combat. The nation that can produce more weapons, train more soldiers, sustain more operations, longer will ultimately prevail. Germany understood this reality, but chose to ignore it, betting that qualitative superiority and tactical brilliance could overcome quantitative disadvantage. The bet failed. American industry buried Germany under an avalanche of equipment the Reich could not match. The Sherman was one instrument in that avalanche, but it was a decisive one. The German High Command called American tanks slow. They watched 4,000 of them advance 400 miles in 26 days. They called them inadequate. They saw them destroy the German armies in France. They called them inferior. They lost the war to them. Sometimes, history has a sense of irony. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.